welcome to every story. And we're going to be reading a story about first we're going to be reading the Bible, and then we're going to be reading the Sabbath, and then we're going to be reading Little Women. Hope you guys enjoy. Make sure to like and subscribe. Hit the bell notifications in the video. Ha ha ha!
Oh!
I have defeated the Bible basher.
Go.
Okay. Bible basher tells me to go.
Hello! How are you doing today? I'm going to turn off my notifications. Alright, so now we are going to read the rest of Matthew 21. I mapped out the rest of Little Women, and it looks like we're going to have 8 more episodes, one of which will have 1 chapter. I don't know which one that will be. And the rest of them will have 2 chapters. So that is how we're going to do this. We're on Matthew chapter 21. We ended last time, yesterday, with verse 22, which says, "And whatever you ask in prayer, you will receive if you have faith." So now we're going to begin with verse 23 and read to the end of the chapter. "And when he entered the temple," that's Jesus, by the way, "and when Jesus entered the temple, the chief priests and the elders of the people came up to him as he was teaching and said, 'By what authority are you doing these things, and who gave you this authority?' Jesus answered them, 'I also will ask you one question, and if you tell me the answer, then I will also tell you by what authority I do these things. The baptism of John, from where did it come? From heaven or from man?' And they discussed it among themselves, saying, 'If we say from heaven, he will say to us, why then did you not believe him? But if we say from man, we are afraid of the crowd, for they all hold that John was a prophet.' So they answered Jesus, 'We do not know.' And he said to them, 'Neither will I tell you by what authority I do these things. What do you think? A man had 2 sons, and he went to the first and said, 'Son, go and work in the vineyard today.' And he answered, 'I will not.' But afterward he changed his mind and went. And he went to the other son and said the same. And he answered, 'I go, sir,' but he did not go. Which of the 2 did the will of his father? They said, 'The first.' Jesus said to them, 'Truly I say to you, the tax collectors and the prostitutes go into the kingdom of God before you. For John gave to you in the way of righteousness, and you did not believe him, but the tax collectors and the prostitutes believed him. And even when you saw it, you did not afterward change your minds and believe him. Hear another parable. There was a master of a house who planted a vineyard." I don't know why he would paint a vineyard. "He planted a vineyard and put a fence around it and dug a winepress in it and built a tower and leased it to tenants, and went into another country. When the season for fruit drew near, he sent his servant to the tenants to get his fruit. And the tenants took his servants and beat one, killed another, and stoned another. Again he sent other servants, more than the first, and they did the same to them. Finally he sent his son to them, saying, 'They will respect my son.' But when the tenants saw the son, they said to themselves, 'This is the heir. Come, let us kill him and have his inheritance.' And they took him and threw him out of the vineyard and killed him. When, therefore, the owner of the vineyard comes, what will he do to those tenants?' They said to him, 'He will put those wretches to a miserable death and let out the vineyard to other tenants who will give him the fruits in their seasons.' Jesus said to them, 'Have you never read in the scriptures, the stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone? This was the Lord's doing, and it is marvelous in our eyes. Therefore, I tell you, the kingdom of God will be taken away from you and given to a people producing its fruits. And the one who falls on this stone will be broken to pieces, and when it falls on anyone, it will crush them.' When the chief priests and the Pharisees heard his parables, they perceived that he was speaking about them." Well, no, duh. "And although they were seeking to arrest him, they feared the crowds because they held him to be a prophet." And that is the end of Matthew chapter 21. So now we are in the book of Little Women, part 2. And in Little Women Part 2, the most recent thing that happened is, of course, Amy is in Europe having a miserable time. She just hates life right now. And so she is writing to her family, telling them about all the awful experiences that she's been having. And at the same time, Jo realizes that she thinks that let's see, what? That Laurie is from Mars. And she actually thought that possibly he might go by an alias name John Carter. And so...
No. Dad, you said it wrong.
And
It's not John Carter.
It's
It's...
Virginia! All right, so here's Kimberly to say what really happened.
Virginia.
I'm sorry, we watched John Carter earlier. Sorry, my hair's all
Not
wet.
today, though.
Yeah, not today. A while back. So, what happened was Amy was having a great time, and she actually met one of Laurie's friends, and they hung out for a few weeks or something like that, and they became really good friends. And then, JJ. And then, she went over, she's going to, where was it next?
First she went to London, then she went to Paris, she went through Germany, she went through Baden-Baden, and she's going to Switzerland, and they're going to meet together in Rome.
Right, that's right. And then, so, Jo has the suspicion that Laurie has a crush on Beth.
Beth has a crush on Laurie.
I think she
No,
means...
it's Beth has a crush on Laurie, is what she thinks. And so what does she do? Because she sees that Laurie's paying attention to
her.
Jo, to her. So what is she going to do?
So she's gonna move to New York so that Amy, well, not Amy, Beth, has a chance to talk to Laurie when she's not there.
Jo can get a job. All right,
Yeah.
let's go.
In San Francisco.
Not San Francisco, New York. New York City. That really chaps my hide. All right, so
Oh, weird.
that is a commercial from the 80s. So if you recognize that commercial and you've heard it before and you know what product it is endorsing, then please put a comment and put hearts and all kinds of happy faces or whatever in the emoji section of the comments. And I'm gonna get my pillow situation set up correctly since Kimberly doesn't understand why.
You have like a million pillows.
Yeah, well, she doesn't understand why I need them. So, alrighty. Hello. All right, so now we're on chapter 10. Yeah, that needs to stop. Perfect. All right, so we're on chapter 10. No, we don't need to have any ballistic items threatening me while I'm reading. All right, so this is chapter 10, Jo's Journal. New York, November. Dear Marmee and Beth, I'm going to write you a regular volume, for I've got lots to tell, though I'm not a fine young lady traveling on the continent. When I lost sight of Father's dear old face, I felt a trifle blue, and might have shed a briny drop or two, if an Irish lady with 4 small children, all crying more or less, hadn't diverted my mind, for I amused myself by dropping gingerbread nuts over the seat every time they opened their mouths to roar. Soon the sun came out, and taking it as a good omen, I cleared up likewise, and enjoyed my journey with all my heart. Mrs. Kirk welcomed me so kindly. I felt at home at once, even in that big house full of strangers. She gave me a funny little sky parlor, all she had, but there is a stove in it, and a nice table in a sunny window, so I can sit here and write whenever I like. A fine view and a church tower opposite atone for the many stairs, and I took a fancy to my den on the spot. The nursery, where I am to teach and sew, is a pleasant room next to Mrs. Kirk's private parlor, and the two little girls are pretty children, rather spoilt, I guess, but they took to me after telling them the 7 bad pigs, and I've no doubt I shall make a model governess. I am to have my meals with the children if I prefer it to the great table, and for the present I do, for I am bashful, though no one will believe it. Now, my dear, make yourself at home, said Mrs. K in her motherly way. I am on the drive from morning to night, as you may suppose, with such a family, but a great anxiety will be off my mind if I know the children are safe with you. My rooms are always open to you, and your own shall be as comfortable as I can make it. There are some pleasant people in the house, if you feel sociable, and your evenings are always free. Come to me if anything goes wrong, and be as happy as you can. There's the tea-bell. I must run and change my cap, and off she bustled, leaving me to settle myself in my new nest. As I went downstairs soon after, I saw something I liked. The flights are very long in this tall house, and I stood waiting at the head of the 3rd one for a little servant girl to lumber up. I saw a queer-looking man come along behind her, take the heavy hod of coal out of her hand, carry it all the way up, put it down at a door nearby, and walk away, saying with a kind nod and a foreign accent, "It goes better so. The little back is too young to have such heaviness. What's it good of him? I like such things, for as father says, trifle shows character." When I mentioned it to Mrs. K that evening, she laughed and said, "That must have been Professor Bayer. He's always doing things of that sort. Mrs. K told me he was from Berlin, very learned and good, but poor as a church mouse, and gives lessons to support himself and 2 little orphan nephews, whom he is educating here, according to the wishes of his sister, who married an American. Not a very romantic story, but it interested me, and I was glad to hear that Mrs. K lends him her parlor for some of his scholars. There is a glass door between it and the nursery, and I mean to peep at him, and then I'll tell you how he looks. He's most 40, so it's no harm, Marmee." After tea and got to bed, romp with the little girls, I attacked the big work-basket and had a quiet evening chatting with my new friend. I shall keep a journal letter and send it once a week, so good night and more tomorrow. Tuesday Eve. Had a lively time in my seminary this morning, for the children acted like Sancho, and at one time I really thought I should shake them all around. Some good angel inspired me to try gymnastics, and I kept it up till they were glad to sit down and keep still. After luncheon, the girl took them out for a walk, and I went with my needlework, like little Mabel with a willing mind. I was thanking my stars that I'd learned to make nice buttonholes when the parlor door opened and shut, and someone began to hum, "Kennst du das Land?" like a big bumblebee. It was dreadfully improper, I know, but I couldn't resist the temptation, and lifting one end of the curtain before the glass door, I peeped in. Professor Bayer was there, and while he arranged his books, I took a good look at him. A regular German, rather stout, with brown hair tumbled all over his head, a bushy beard, droll nose, the kindest eyes I ever saw, and a splendid big voice that does one's ears good, after our sharp and slipshod American gabble. His clothes were rusty, his hands were large, and he hadn't a handsome feature in his face, except his beautiful teeth. Yet I liked him, for he had a fine head, his linen was spandy nice, and he looked like a gentleman, though 2 buttons were off his coat, and there was a patch on one shoe. He looked sober in spite of his humming, till he went to the window to turn the hyacinth bulbs toward the sun and stroke the cat, who received him like an old friend. Then he smiled, and when a tap came at the door, called out in a loud, brisk tone, "Herren?" I was just going to run when I caught sight of a morsel of a child carrying a big book and stopped to see what was going on. "Me wants my bear," said the mite, slamming down her book and running to meet him. "Thou shalt have thy bear. Come, then, and take a good hug from him, my Tina," said the professor, catching her up with a laugh and holding her so high over his head that she had to stoop her little face to kiss him. Now me must Teddy my lesson, went on the funny little thing. So he put her up at the table, opened a great dictionary she had brought, and gave her a paper and pencil, and she scribbled away, turning a leaf now and then, and passing her little fat finger down the page as if finding a word so soberly that I nearly betrayed myself by a laugh, while Mr. Bear stood stroking her pretty hair with a fatherly look that made me think she must be his own, though she looked more French than German. Another knock and the appearance of two young ladies sent me back to my work, and there I virtuously remained through all the noise and gabbling that went on next door. One of the girls kept laughing affectedly, and saying, "Now, Professor," in a coquettish tone, and the other pronounced her German with an accent that must have made it hard for him to keep sober. Both seemed to try his patience sorely, for more than once I heard him say emphatically, "No, no, it is not so. You have to attend to what I say," and once there was a loud rap as if he struck the table with his book, followed by the despairing exclamation, "Prut! It all goes bad this day." Poor man, I pitied him, and when the girls were gone, took just one more peep to see if he survived it. He seemed to have thrown himself back in his chair, tired out, and sat there with his eyes shut till the clock struck 2, when he jumped up, put his books in his pocket as if ready for another lesson, and, taking little Tina, who had fallen asleep on the sofa, in his arms, he carried her quietly away. I guess he has a hard life of it. Mrs. Kirk asked me if I wouldn't go down to the 5 o'clock dinner, and feeling a little bit homesick, I thought I would just see what sort of people are under the same roof with me. So I made myself respectable, and tried to slip in behind Mrs. Kirk, but as she is short and I'm tall, my efforts at concealment were rather a failure. She gave me a seat by her, and after my face cooled off, I plucked up courage and looked about me. The long table was full, and everyone intent on getting their dinner, the gentlemen especially, who seemed to be eating on time, for they bolted in every sense of the word, vanishing as soon as they were done. There was the usual assortment of young men absorbed in themselves, young couples absorbed in each other, married ladies in their babies, and old gentlemen in politics. I don't think I shall care to have much to do with any of them, except one sweet-faced maiden lady who looks as if she had something in her. Cast away at the very bottom of the table was the professor, shouting answers to the questions of a very inquisitive deaf old gentleman on one side, and talking philosophy with a Frenchman on the other. If Amy had been here, she'd have turned her back on him forever, because, sad to relate, he had a great appetite and shovelled in his dinner in a manner which would have horrified her ladyship. I didn't mind, for I liked to see folks eat with a relish, as Hannah says, and the poor man must have needed a deal of food after teaching idiots all day. As I went upstairs after dinner, two of the young men were settling their beavers before the hall mirror, and I heard one say low to the other, "Who's the new party? Governess, or something of that sort. What's the deuce is she at our table for?" "Friend of the old lady's. Handsome head, but no style. Not a bit of it. Give us a light and come on." I felt angry at first, and then I didn't care, for a governess is as good as a clerk, and I've got sense, if I haven't style, which is more than some people have, judging from the remarks of the elegant beings who clattered away, smoking like bad chimneys. I hate ordinary people. Thursday. Yesterday was a quiet day spent in teaching, sewing, and writing in my little room, which is very cozy with a light and fire. I picked up a few bits of news and was introduced to the professor. It seems that Tina is the child of the Frenchwoman who does the fine ironing in the laundry here. The little thing has lost her heart to Mr. Bear, and follows him about the house like a dog whenever he is at home, which delights him, as he is very fond of children, though a bachelor. Kitty and Minnie Kirk likewise regard him with affection, and tell all sorts of stories about the plays he invents, the presents he brings, and the splendid tales he tells. The young men quiz him, it seems, call him Old Fritz, Lager Beer, Ursa Major, and make all all manner of jokes on his name, but he enjoys it like a boy, Mrs. K says, and takes it so good-naturedly that they all like him in spite of his odd ways. The maiden lady is a Miss Norton, rich, cultivated, and kind. She spoke to me at dinner today, for I went to the table again. It's such fun to watch people, and asked me to come and see her at her room. She has fine books and pictures, knows interesting persons, and seems friendly, so I shall make myself agreeable, for I do want to get into good society, only it isn't the same sort that Amy likes. I was in our parlor last evening when Mr. Bear came in with some newspapers for Mrs. Kirk. She wasn't there, but Minnie, who is a little old woman, introduced me very prettily. This is Mamma's friend, Miss March. Yes, and she's jolly, and we like her lots, added Kitty, who is an infant terrible. We both bowed, and then we laughed, for the prim introduction and the blunt addition were rather a comical contrast. Ah, yes, I hear these naughty ones go to vex you. Miss March, if so again, call at me, and I come, he said, with a threatening frown that delighted the little wretches. I promised I would, and he departed, but it seems as if I was doomed to see a good deal of him, for today, as I passed his door on my way out by accident, I knocked against it with my umbrella. It flew open, and there he stood in his dressing-gown, with a big blue sock on one hand and a darning needle in the other. He didn't seem at all ashamed of it, for when I explained and hurried on, he waved his hand, sock and all, saying in his loud, cheerful way, "You have a fine day to make your walk. Bon voyage, mademoiselle." I laughed all the way downstairs, but it was a little pathetic also to think of the poor man having to mend his own clothes. The German gentleman embroiderer, I know, but darning hose is another thing, and not so pretty. Saturday. Nothing has happened to write about except a call on Miss Norton, who has a room full of lovely things, and who was very charming, for she showed me all her treasures and asked me if I would sometimes go with her to lectures and concerts, as her escort if I enjoyed them. She put it as a favor, but I'm sure Mrs. Kirk has told her about us, and she does it out of kindness to me. I am as proud as Lucifer, but such favors from such people don't burden me, and I accepted gratefully. When I got back to the nursery, there was such an uproar in the parlor that I looked in, and there was Mr. Bear, down on his hands and knees with Tina on his back, Kitty leading him with a jump rope, and Minnie feeding two small boys with seed cakes as they roared and ramped in cages built of chairs. "We are playing Nagerie," explained Kitty. "Dis is mine effluent," added Tina, holding in by the professor's hair. Oh, it's effluent. That's what it is. Mamma always allows us to do what we like Saturday afternoon when Franz and Emil come, don't she, Mr. Bear? Said Minnie. The effluent sat up, looking as much in earnest as any of them, and said soberly to me, "I give you my worst, it is so. If we make too large a noise, you shall say hush to us, and we go more softly." I promised to do so, but left the door open and enjoyed the fun as much as they did, for a more glorious frolic I never witnessed. They played tag, and soldiers danced and sung, and when it began to grow dark, they all piled on to the sofa about the professor, while he told charming fairy stories of the storks on the chimney-tops, and the little kobolds who ride the snowflakes as they fall. I wish Americans were as simple and natural as Germans, don't you? I'm so fond of writing, I should go spinning on forever if motives of economy didn't stop me, for though I've used thin paper and written fine, I tremble to think of the stamps this long letter will need. Pray forward Amy's as soon as you can spare them. My small news will sound very flat after her splendors, but you will like them, I know. Is Teddy studying so hard that he can't find time to write to his friends? Take good care of him for me, Beth, and tell me all about the babies, and give heaps of love to everyone from your faithful Joe. P.S. On reading over my letter, it strikes me as rather Bayery, but I'm always interested in odd people, and I really had nothing else to write about. Bless you. December. My precious Betsy, as this is to be a scribble-scrabble letter, I direct it to you, for it may amuse you, and give you some idea of my goings-on, for though quiet, they are rather amusing, for which, oh, be joyful, after what Amy would call Herculaneum efforts in the way of mental and moral agriculture, my young ideas began to shoot, and my little twigs to bend as I could wish. They are not so interesting to me as Tina and the boys, but I do my duty by them, and they are very fond of me. Franz and Emil are jolly little lads, quite after my own heart, for the mixture of German and American spirit in them produces a constant state of effervescence. Saturday afternoons are riotous times, whether spent in the house or out, for on pleasant days they all go to walk, like a seminary, with the professor and myself to keep order, and then such fun. We are very good friends now, and I've begun to take lessons. I really couldn't help it, and it all came about in such a funny way that I must tell you. To begin at the beginning, Mrs. Kirk called me one day as I passed Mr. Bayer's room, where she was rummaging. Did you ever see such a den, my dear? Just come and help me put these books to rights, for I turned everything upside down, trying to discover what he has done with the 6 new handkerchiefs I gave him not long ago. I went in, and while we worked I looked about me, for it was a den to be sure, books and papers everywhere, a broken meerschaum, and an old flute over the mantelpiece, as if done with. A ragged bird without any tail chirped on one window seat, and a box of white mice adorned the other. Half-finished boats and bits of string lay among the manuscripts. Dirty little boots stood drying before the fire, and traces of the dearly beloved boys, for whom he makes a slave of himself, were to be seen all over the room. After a grand rummage, 3 of the missing articles were found, one over the birdcage, one covered with ink, and a third, burnt brown, having been used as a holder. Such a man, laughed good-natured Mrs. K, as she put the relics in the rag bag. I suppose the others are torn up to rig ships, bandage cut fingers, or make kite tails. It's dreadful, but I can't scold him. He's so absent-minded and good-natured, he lets those boys ride over him rough-shod. I agreed to do his washing and mending, but he forgets to give out his things, and I forget to look them over, so he comes to a sad pass sometimes. Let me mend them, said I. I don't mind it, and he needn't know. I'd like to. He's so kind to me about bringing my letters and lending books. So I have got his things in order, and knit heels into 2 pairs of the socks, for they were boggled out of shape with his queer darns. Nothing was said, and I hoped he wouldn't find it out, but one day last week he caught me at it. Hearing the lessons he gives to others has interested and amused me so much that I took a fancy to learn, for Tina runs in and out, leaving the door open, and I can hear. I had been sitting near this door, finishing off the last sock, and trying to understand what he said to a new scholar who is as stupid as I am. The girl had gone, and I thought he had also. It was so still, and I was busily gabbling over a verb and rocking to and fro in a most absurd way, when a little crow made me look up, and there was Mr. Bayer, looking and laughing quietly, when he made signs to Tina not to betray him. So, he said, as I stopped and stared like a goose, you peep at me, I peep at you, and that is not bad, but I see I am not pleasanting when I say, have you a wish for German? Yes, but you are too busy. I am too stupid to learn, I blundered out, as red as a beet. Prut, we will make the time, and we fail not to find the sense. At Effening I shall give a little lesson with much gladness, for look you, Mies March, I have this debt to pay, and he pointed to my work. Yes, they say to one another, these so kind ladies, he is a stupid old fellow. He will not see what we He will not see what we do. He will never observe that his sock heels go not in holes any more. He will think his buttons grow out new when they fall, and believe that strings make theirselves. Ah, but I have an eye, and I see much. I have a heart, and I feel the thanks for this. Come, a little lesson then and now, or no more good fairy works for me and mine. Of course, I couldn't say anything after that, and as it really is a splendid opportunity, I made the bargain, and we began. I took 4 lessons, and then I stuck fast in a grammatical bog. The professor was very patient with me, but it must have been torment to him, and now and then he'd look at me with such an expression of mild despair that it was a toss-up with me whether to laugh or cry. I tried both ways, and when it came to a sniff of utter mortification and woe, he just threw the grammar onto the floor and marched out of the room. I felt myself disgraced and deserted forever, but didn't blame him a particle, and was scrambling my papers together, meaning to rush upstairs and shake myself hard, when in he came, as brisk and beaming as if I'd covered my name with glory. Now we shall try a new way. You and I will read these pleasant little Märchen together, and dig no more in that dry book that goes in the corner for making us trouble. He spoke so kindly, and opened Hans Andersen's fairy tales so invitingly before me, that I was more ashamed than ever, and went at my lesson in a neck-or-nothing style that seemed to amuse him immensely. I forgot my bashfulness, and pegged away, no other words will express it, with all my might, tumbling over long words, pronouncing according to the inspiration of the minute, and doing my very best. When I finished reading my first page, and stopped for a breath, he clapped his hands and cried out in his hearty way, "Das ist gut! Now we will go well. My turn. I do him in German. Give me your ear." And away he went, rumbling out the words with his strong voice, and a relish which was good to see as well as hear. Fortunately, the story was The Constant Tin Soldier, which is droll, you know, so I could laugh, and I did, though I didn't understand half he read. For I couldn't help it. He was so earnest, I so excited, and the whole thing so comical. After that we got on better, and now I read my lessons pretty well, for this way of studying suits me, and I can see that the grammar gets tucked into the tales and the poetry as one gives pills in jelly. I like it very much, and he don't seem tired of it yet. Which is very good of him, isn't it? I mean to give him something on Christmas, for I don't dare offer money. Tell me something nice, Marmee. I'm glad Laurie seems so happy and busy that he has given up smoking and lets his hair grow. You see, Beth manages him better than I did. I'm not jealous, dear. Do your best, only don't make a saint of him. I'm afraid I couldn't like him without a spice of human naughtiness. Read him bits of my letters. I haven't time to write much, and that will do just as well. Thank heaven, Beth continues so comfortable. January. A happy new year to you all, my dearest family, which of course includes Mr. L. and a young man by the name of Teddy. I can't tell you how much I enjoyed your Christmas bundle, for I didn't get it till night, and had given up hoping. Your letter came in the morning, but you said nothing about a parcel, meaning it for a surprise, so I was disappointed, for I'd had a kind of a feeling that you wouldn't forget me. I felt a little low in my mind as I sat up in my room after tea, and when the big, muddy, battered-looking bundle was brought to me, I just hugged it and pranced. It was so homey and refreshing that I sat down on the floor and read and looked and ate and laughed and cried in my usual absurd way. The things were just what I wanted, and all the better for being made instead of bought. Beth's new ink bib was capital, and Hannah's box of hard gingerbread will be a treasure. I'll be sure to wear the nice flannels you sent, Marmee, and read carefully the books Father has marked. Thank you all, heaps and heaps. Speaking of books, reminds me that I'm getting rich in that line, for on New Year's Day Mr. Bayer gave me a fine Shakespeare. It is one he values much, and I've often admired it, set up in the place of honor with his German Bible, Plato, Homer, and Milton, so you may imagine how I felt when he brought it down without its cover and showed me my name on it, from my friend Friedrich Bayer. You say often you wish a library. Here I give you one, for between these two lids, he meant covers, is many books in one. Read him well, and he will help you much, for the study of character in this book will help you read it in the world, and paint it with your pen. I thanked him as well as I could, and talked now about my library as if I had 100 books. I never knew how much there was in Shakespeare before, but then I never had a Bayer to explain it to me. Now don't laugh at his horrid name. It isn't pronounced either bear or beer, as people will say it, but something between the two, as only Germans can do it. I'm glad you both like what I tell you about him, and hope you will know him some day. Mother would admire his warm heart, father his wise head. I admire both, and feel rich in my new friend Friedrich Bayer. Not having much money, or knowing what he'd like, I got several little things and put them about the room where he would find them unexpectedly. They were useful, pretty, or funny. A new stand dish on his table, a little vase for his flower, he always has one, or a bit of green in a glass to keep him fresh, he says, and a holder for his blower, excuse me, so that he needn't burn up what Amy calls mouchoirs. I made it like those Beth invented, a big butterfly with a fat body and black and yellow wings, worsted feelings, and bead eyes. It took his fancy immensely, and he put it on his mantelpiece as an article of virtue. So it was rather a failure after all. Poor as he is, he didn't forget a servant or a child in the house, and not a soul here, from the French laundry woman to Miss Norton, forgot him. I was so glad of that. They got up a masquerade and had a gay time. New Year's Eve, I didn't mean to go down, having no dress, but at the last minute Mrs. Kirk remembered some old brocades, and Mrs. Norton gave me lace and feathers, so I rigged up as Mrs. Malaprop and sailed in with a mask on. No one knew me, for I disguised my voice, and no one dreamed of the silent, haughty Miss March, for they think I am very stiff and cool, most of them, and so I am to whippersnappers. Haughty Miss March could dance and dress and burst out into a nice derangement of epitaphs, like an allegory on the banks of the Nile. I enjoyed it very much, and when we unmasked, it was fun to see them stare at me. I heard one of the young men tell another that he knew I'd been an actress. In fact, he thought he remembered seeing me at one of the minor theaters. Meg will relish that joke. Mr. Bayer was Nick Bottom, and Tina was Titania, a perfect little fairy in his arms. To see them dance was quite a landscape, to use a Teddyism. I had a very happy New Year after all, and when I thought it over in my room, I felt as if I was getting on a little in spite of my many failures, for I'm cheerful all the time now, work with a will, and take more interest in other people than I used to, which is satisfactory. Bless you all, ever your loving Joe. And that is the end of chapter 10, which was called Joe's Writings, or Joe's Journals, or something like that. All right, I'm going to back this up just a little bit. And chapter 11 is called A Friend, and I am still having some issues today with trying to figure out how to get the pillows. All right. It'd be nice if I had something that had something to support my head.
High back.
Yeah. And maybe a stand right here that I could just hold instead of having to hold myself. I am so whiny. All right, let me just go ahead and get started. Chapter 11, A Friend. Though very happy in the social atmosphere about her and very busy with the daily work that earned her bread and made it sweeter for the effort, Jo still found time for literary labors. The purpose which now took possession of her was a natural one to a poor and ambitious girl, but the means the means she took to gain her end were not the best. She saw that money conferred power, money and power, therefore, she resolved to have, not to be used for herself alone, but for those whom she loved more than self. The dream of filling home with comforts, giving Beth everything she wanted, from strawberries in winter to an organ in her bedroom, going abroad herself, and always having more than enough, so that she might indulge in the luxury of charity, had been for years Jo's most cherished castle in the air. The prize story experience had seemed to open a way which might, after long traveling and much uphill work, lead to this delightful chateau in Espagne. But the novel disaster quenched her courage for a time, for public opinion is a giant which has frightened stouter-hearted jacks on bigger beanstalks than hers. Like that immortal hero, she reposed a while after the first attempt, which resulted in a tumble. And the least lovely of the giant treasures, if I remember rightly, but the up again and take another spirit was as strong in Jo as in Jack. So she scrambled up on the shady side this time and got more booty, and nearly left behind her what was far more precious than the money bags. She took writing sensation stories, for in those dark ages even all perfect America read rubbish. She told no one, but concocted a thrilling tale and boldly carried it herself to Mr. Dashwood, editor of the Weekly Volcano. She had never read Sartor Resartus, but she had a womanly instinct that clothes possess an influence more powerful over many than the worth of character or the magic of manners. So she dressed herself in her best, and trying to persuade herself that she was neither excited nor nervous, bravely climbed 2 pairs of dark and dirty stairs to find herself in a disorderly room, a cloud of cigar smoke, and the presence of 3 gentlemen sitting with their heels rather higher than their hats, which articles of dress none of them took the trouble to remove on her appearance. Somewhat daunted by this reception, Jo hesitated on the threshold, murmuring in much embarrassment, "Excuse me, I was looking for the Weekly Volcano office. I wish to see Mr. Dashwood." Down went the highest pair of heels, up rose the smokiest gentleman, and carefully cherishing his cigar between his fingers, he advanced with a nod and a countenance expressive of nothing but sleep. Feeling that she must get through with the matter somehow, Jo produced her manuscript, and blushing redder and redder with each sentence, blundered out fragments of the little speech carefully prepared for the occasion. "A friend of mine desired me to offer a story just as an experiment. Would like your opinion. Be glad to write more if that suits." While she blushed and blundered, Mr. Dashwood had taken the manuscript and was turning over the leaves with a pair of rather dirty fingers, and casting critical glances up and down the neat pages. "Not a first attempt, I take it," observing that the pages were numbered, covered only on one side, and not tied up with a ribbon, sure sign of a novice. "No, sir, she has had some experience, and got a prize for a tale in the Blarney Stone Banner." "Oh, did she?" And Mr. Dashwood gave Jo a quick look, which seemed to take note of everything she had on, from the bow in her bonnet to the buttons in her boots. "Well, you can leave it if you like. We've more of this sort of thing on hand than we know what to do with at present, but I'll run my eye over it and give you an answer next week." Now, Jo did not like to leave it, for Mr. Dashwood didn't suit her at all, but under the circumstances there was nothing for her to do but bow and walk away, looking particularly tall and dignified, as she was apt to do when nettled or abashed. Just then she was both, for it was perfectly evident from the knowing glances exchanged among the gentlemen that her little fiction of "my friend" was considered a good joke, and a laugh produced by some inaudible remark of the editor as he closed the door completed her discomfiture. Half resolving never to return, she went home and worked off her irritation by stitching pinafores vigorously, and in an hour or two was cool enough to laugh over the scene and long for next week. When she went again, Mr. Dashwood was alone, whereat she rejoiced. Mr. Dashwood was much wider awake than before, which was agreeable, and Mr. Dashwood was not too deeply absorbed in a cigar to remember his manners, so the second interview was much more comfortable than the first. "We'll take this. Editors never say aye, if you don't object to a few alterations. It's too long, but omitting the passages I've marked will make it just the right length," he said in a businesslike tone. Jo hardly knew her own MS again, so crumpled and underscored were its pages. MS is manuscript, I think. So crumpled and underscored were its pages and paragraphs, but feeling as a tender parent might on being asked to cut off her baby's legs in order that it might fit into a new cradle, she looked at the marked passages and was surprised to find that all the moral reflections which she had carefully put in as ballast for much romance had all been stricken out. "But, sir, I thought every story should have some sort of a moral, so I took care to have a few of my sinners repent." Mr. Dashwood's editorial gravity relaxed into a smile, for Jo had forgotten her friend and spoken as only an author could. "People want to be amused, not preached at, you know. Morals don't sell nowadays," which was not quite a correct statement, by the way. "You think it would do with all these alterations, then?" "Yes, it's a new plot, and pretty well worked up. Language good, and so on," was Mr. Dashwood's affable reply. "Well, what compensation?" began Jo, not exactly knowing how to express herself. "Oh, yes, well, we'll give you 25 to 30 for things of this sort. Pay when it comes out," returned Mr. Dashwood, as if that point had escaped him. Such trifles often do escape the editorial mind, it is said. "Very well, you can have it," said Jo, handing back the story with a satisfied air, for after the $1 a column work, even 25 seemed good pay. "Shall I tell my friend you will take another if she has one better than this?" asked Jo, unconscious of her little slip of the tongue and emboldened by her success. "Well, we'll look at it. Can't promise to take it. Tell her to make it short and spicy, and never mind the moral. What name would your friend like to put on it?" in a careless tone. "None at all, if you please. She doesn't wish her name to appear, and has no nom de plume," said Jo, blushing in spite of herself. "Just as she likes, of course. The tale will be out next week. Will you call for the money, or shall I send it?" asked Mr. Dashwood, who felt a natural desire to know who his new contributor might be. "I'll call. Good morning, sir." As she departed, Mr. Dashwood put up his feet with the graceful remark, "Poor and proud as usual, but she'll do." Following Mr. Dashwood's directions, and making Mrs. Northberry her model, Jo rashly took a plunge into the frothy sea of sensational literature. But, thanks to the life-preserver thrown her by a friend, she came up again not much the worse for her ducking. Like most young scribblers, she went abroad for her characters and scenery, and banditti, counts, gypsies, nuns, and duchesses appeared upon her stage, and played their parts with as much accuracy and spirit as could be expected. Her readers were not particular about such trifles as grammar, punctuation, and probability, and Mr. Dashwood graciously permitted her to fill his columns at the lowest prices, not thinking it necessary to tell her that the real cause of his hospitality was the fact that one of his hacks, on being offered higher wages, had basely left him in the lurch. She soon became interested in her work, for her emaciated purse grew stout, and the little hoard she was making to take Beth to the mountains next summer grew slowly but surely as the weeks passed. One thing disturbed her satisfaction, and that was that she did not tell them at home. She had a feeling that father and mother would not approve, and preferred to have her own way first, and beg pardon afterward. It was easy to keep her secret, for no name appeared with her stories. Mr. Dashwood had, of course, found it out very soon, but promised to be dumb, and, for a wonder, kept his word. She thought it would do her no harm, for she sincerely meant to write nothing of which she should be ashamed, and quieted all pricks of conscience by anticipations of the happy minute when she should show her earnings and laugh over her well-kept secret. But Mr. Dashwood rejected any but thrilling tales, and as thrills could not be produced except by harrowing up the souls of the readers, history and romance, land and sea, science and art, police records and lunatic asylums had to be ransacked for the purpose. Jo soon found that her innocent experience had given her but few glimpses of the tragic world which underlies society. So, regarding it in a bright light, she set about supplying her deficiencies with a characteristic energy, eager to find material for stories and bent on making them original in plot, if not masterly in execution. She searched newspapers for accidents, incidents, and crimes. She excited the suspicions of public librarians by asking for works on poisons. She studied faces in the street and characters, good, bad, and indifferent, all about her. She delved in the dust of ancient times for facts or fictions so old that they were as good as new, and introduced herself to folly, sin, and misery as well as her limited opportunities allowed. She thought she was prospering finely, but unconsciously she was beginning to desecrate some of the womanliest attributes of a woman's character. She was living in bad society, and, imaginary though it was, its influence affected her, for she was feeding heart and fancy on dangerous and unsubstantial food, and was fast brushing the innocent bloom from her nature by a premature acquaintance with the darker side of life, which comes soon enough to all of us. She was beginning to feel rather than see this, for much describing of other people's passions and feelings set her to studying and speculating about her own, a morbid amusement in which healthy young minds do not voluntarily indulge. Wrongdoing always brings its own punishment, and when Jo most needed hers, she got it. I don't know whether the study of Shakespeare helped her to read character, or the natural instinct of a woman for what was honest, brave, and strong, but while endowing her imaginary heroes with every perfection under the sun, Jo was discovering a live hero who interested her in spite of many human imperfections. Mr. Bear, in one of their conversations, had advised her to study simple, true, and lovely characters wherever she found them, as good training for a writer. Jo took him at his word, for she coolly turned round and studied him, a proceeding which would have much surprised him had he known it, for the worthy professor was very humble in his own conceit. Why everybody liked him was what puzzled Jo at first. He was neither rich nor great, young nor handsome. In no respect was it called fascinating, imposing, or brilliant, and yet he was as attractive as a genial fire, and people seemed to gather about him as naturally as about a warm hearth. He was poor, yet always appeared to be giving something away. A stranger, yet every one was his friend. No longer young, but as happy-hearted as a boy, plain and odd, yet his face looked beautiful to many, and his oddities were freely forgiven for his sake. Jo often watched him, trying to discover the charm, and at last decided that it was benevolence which worked the miracle. If he had any sorrow, it sat with its head under its wing, and he turned only his sunny side to the world. There were lines upon his forehead, but time seemed to have touched him gently, remembering how kind he was to others. The pleasant curves about his mouth were the memorials of many friendly words and cheery laughs. His eyes were never cold or hard, and his His big hand was a warm, strong grasp that was more expressive than words. His very clothes seemed to partake of the hospitable nature of the wearer. They looked as if they were at ease and liked to be made comfortable. His capacious waistcoat was suggestive of a large heart underneath. His rusty coat had a social air, and the baggy pockets plainly proved that his little hands often went in empty and came out full. His very boots were benevolent, and his collars never stiff and raspy like other people's. "That's it," said Jo to herself, when she at length discovered that genuine goodwill toward one's fellow men could beautify and dignify even a stout German teacher who shoveled in his dinner, darned his own socks, and was burdened with the name of Bayer. Jo valued goodness highly, but she also possessed a most feminine respect for intellect, and a little discovery which she made about the professor added much to her regard for him. He never spoke of himself, and no one ever knew that in his native city he had been a man much honored and esteemed for learning and integrity, till the countrymen came to see him, and in a conversation with Miss Norton divulged the pleasing fact. From her, Jo learned it, and liked it all the better, because Mr. Bayer had never told it. She felt proud to know that he was an honored professor in Berlin, though only a poor language master in America, and his homely, hard-working life was much beautified by the spice of romance which this discovery gave it. Another and a better gift than intellect was shown her in a most expected manner. Miss Norton had the entree into literary society, which Jo would have had no chance of seeing but for her. The solitary woman felt an interest in the ambitious girl, kindly conferred many favors of this sort both on Jo and the professor. She took them with her one night to a select symposium held in honor of several celebrities. Jo went prepared to bow down and adore the mighty ones whom she had worshipped with youthful enthusiasm afar off, but her reverence for genius received a severe shock that night, and it took her some time to recover from the discovery that the great creatures were only men and women after all. Imagine her dismay on stealing a glance of timid admiration at the poet whose lines suggested an ethereal being fed on spirit, fire, and dew, to behold him devouring his supper with an ardor which flushed his intellectual countenance. Turning as from a fallen idol, she made other discoveries which rapidly dispelled her romantic illusions. The great novelist vibrated between two decanters with the regularity of a pendulum. The famous divine flirted openly with one of the Madame de Staëls of the age, who looked daggers at another Corinne, who was amiably satirizing her after outmaneuvering her in efforts to absorb the profound philosopher who imbibed tea Johannianly and appeared to slumber, the loquacity of the lady rendering speech impossible. The scientific celebrities, forgetting their mollusks and glacial periods, gossiped about art while devoting themselves to oysters and ices with characteristic energy. The young musician, who was charming the city like a second Orpheus, talked horses, and the specimen of the British nobility happened to be the most ordinary man of the party. Before the evening was half over, Jo felt so completely disillusionnée that she sat down in a corner to recover herself. Mr. Bayer soon joined her, looking rather out of his element, and presently several of the philosophers, each mounted on his hobby, came ambling up to hold an intellectual tournament in the recess. The conversation was miles beyond Jo's comprehension, but she enjoyed it, though Kant and Hegel were unknown gods. Kant and Hegel were unknown gods, the subjective and objective unintelligible terms, and the only thing evolved from her inner consciousness was a bad headache after it was all over. It dawned upon her gradually that the world was being picked to pieces and put together on new and, according to the talkers, on infinitely better principles than before, that religion was in a fair way to be reasoned into nothingness, and intellect was to be the only God. Jo knew nothing about philosophy or metaphysics of any sort, but a curious excitement, half pleasurable, half painful, came over her as she listened with a sense of being turned adrift into time and space like a young balloon out on a holiday. She looked round to see how the professor liked it, and found him looking at her with the grimmest expression she had ever seen him wear. He shook his head and beckoned her to come away, but she was fascinated just then by the freedom of speculative philosophy, and kept her seat trying to find out what the wise gentleman intended to rely upon after they annihilated all the old beliefs. Now Mr. Bear was a diffident man, and slow to offer his own opinions, not because they were unsettled, but too sincere and earnest to be lightly spoken. As he glanced from Jo to several other young people attracted by the brilliancy of the philosophic pyrotechnics, he knit his brows and longed to speak, fearing that some inflammable young soul would be led astray by the rockets to find, when the display was over, that they had only an empty stick or a scorched hand. He bore it as long as he could, but when he was appealed to for an opinion, he blazed up with honest indignation, and defended religion with all the eloquence of truth, an eloquence which made his broken English musical, and his plain face beautiful. Good night. Obviously, I've been going a while. He had a hard fight, for the wise men argued well, but he didn't know when he was beaten, and stood to his colors like a man. Somehow, as he talked, the world got right again to Jo. The old beliefs that had lasted so long seemed better than the new. God was not a blind force, and immortality was not a pretty fable, but a blessed fact. She felt as if she had solid ground under her feet again, and when Mr. Bear paused, out-talked, but not one whit convinced, Jo wanted to clap her hands and thank him. She did neither, but she remembered this scene and gave the professor her heartiest respect, for she knew it cost him an effort to speak out then and there, because his conscience would not let him be silent. She began to see that character is a better possession than money, rank, intellect, or beauty, and to feel that if greatness is what a wise man has defined it to be, truth, reverence, and goodwill, then her friend Frederick Bear was not only good, but great. This belief strengthened daily. She valued his esteem, she coveted his respect, she wanted to be worthy of his friendship, and just when the wish was sincerest, she came near losing everything. It all grew out of a cocked hat, for one evening the professor came in to give Jo her lesson with a paper soldier cap on his head, which Tina had put there, and he had forgotten to take off. It's evident he doesn't prink at his glass before coming down, thought Jo, with a smile as he said, "Good evening," and sat soberly down, quite unconscious of the ludicrous contrast between his subject and his headgear, for he was going to read her The Death of Wallenstein. She said nothing at first, for she liked to hear him laugh out his big, hearty laugh when anything funny happened, so she left him to discover it for himself, and presently forgot all about it, for to hear a German read Schiller is rather an absorbing occupation. After the reading came the lesson, which was a lively one, for Jo was in a gay mood that night, and the cocked hat kept her eyes dancing with merriment. The professor didn't know what to make of her, and stopped at last to ask, with an air of mild surprise that was irresistible, "Miss March, for what do you laugh in your master's face? Have you no respect for me, that you go on so bad?" How can I be respectful, sir, when you forget to take your hat off? Said Joe, lifting his hand to his head. The absent-minded professor gravely felt and removed the little cocked hat, looked at it a minute, and then threw back his head and laughed like a merry bass viol. By the way, I don't think anybody in our society today would even notice that. Ah, I see him now. It is that imp Tina who makes me a fool with my cap. Well, it is nothing, but you see, if this lesson goes not well, you shall wear him. But the lesson did not go at all for a few minutes, because Mr. Bear caught sight of the picture on the hat, and, unfolding it, said with an air of great disgust, I wish these papers did not come in the house. They are not for children to see, nor young people to read. It is not well, and I have no patience with those who make this harm. Joe glanced at the sheet and saw a pleasing illustration, composed of a lunatic, a corpse, a villain, and a viper. She did not like it, but the impulse that made her turn it over was not one of displeasure, but fear, because for a minute she fancied the paper was the volcano. It was not, however, and her panic subsided as she remembered that even if it had been, and one of her own tales in it, there would have been no name to betray her. She had betrayed herself, however, by a look and a blush, for though an absent man, the professor saw a good deal more than people fancied. He knew that Joe wrote, and had met her down among the newspaper offices more than once, but as she never spoke of it, he asked no questions, in spite of a strong desire to see her work. Now it occurred to him that she was doing what she was ashamed to own, and it troubled him. He did not say to himself, it is none of my business, I've no right to say anything, as many people would have done. He only remembered that she was young and poor, a girl far away from mother's love and father's care, and he was moved to help her with an impulse as quick and natural as that which would prompt him to put out his hand and save a baby from a puddle. All this flashed through his mind in a minute, but not a trace of it appeared in his face, and by the time the paper was turned and Joe's needle threaded, he was ready to say quite naturally, but very gravely, Yes, you are right to put it from you. I do not like to think that good young girls should see such things. They are made pleasant to some, but I would more rather give my boys gunpowder to play with than this bad trash. All may not be bad, only silly, you know, and if there is a demand for it, I don't see any harm in supplying it. Many very respectable people make an honest living out of what are called sensation stories, said Joe, scratching gathers so energetically that a row of little slits followed her pen. There is a demand for whiskey, but I think you and I do not care to sell it. If the respectable people knew what harm they did, they would not feel that the living was honest. They have no right to put poison in the sugar plum and let the small ones eat it. No, they should think a little and sweep mud in the street before they do this thing. Mr. Bear spoke warmly and walked to the fire, crumbling the paper in his hands. Joe sat still, looking as if the fire had come to her, for her cheeks burned long after the cocked hat had turned to smoke and gone harmlessly up the chimney. I should like much to send all the rest after him, muttered the professor, coming back with a relieved air. Joe thought what a blaze her pile of papers upstairs would make, and her hard-earned money lay rather heavily on her conscience at that minute. Then she thought consolingly to herself, mine are not like that. They are only silly, never bad, so I won't be worried. And taking up her book, she said with a studious face, Shall we go on, sir? I'll be very good and proper now. I shall hope so, was all he said, but he meant more than she imagined, and the grave, kind look he gave her made her feel as if the words Weekly Volcano were printed in large type on her forehead. As soon as she went to her room, she got out her papers and carefully reread every one of her stories. Being a little short-sighted, Mr. Bear sometimes used eyeglasses, and Jo had tried them once, smiling, to see how they magnified the fine print of her book. Now she seemed to have got on the professor's mental or moral spectacles also, for the faults of these poor stories glared at her dreadfully and filled her with dismay. They are trash, and will soon be worse than trash if I go on, for each is more sensational than the last. I've gone blindly on, hurting myself and other people for the sake of money. I know it's so, for I can't read this stuff in sober earnest without being horribly ashamed of it. And what should I do if they were seen at home, or Mr. Bear got hold of them? Jo turned hot at the bare ideas, and stuffed the whole bundle into her stove, nearly setting the chimney afire with the blaze. Yes, that's the best place for such inflammable nonsense. I'd better turn the house down, or burn the house down, I suppose, than let other people blow themselves up with my gunpowder, she thought, as she watched the demon of the Jura whisk away, a little black cinder with fiery eyes. But when nothing remained of all her 3 months' work, except a heap of ashes and the money in her lap, Jo looked sober as she sat on the floor, wondering what she ought to do about her wages. I think I haven't done much harm yet, and may keep this to pay for my time, she said after a long meditation, adding impatiently, I almost wish I hadn't any conscience. It's so inconvenient. If I didn't care about doing right, and didn't feel uncomfortable when doing wrong, I should get on capitally. I can't help wishing sometimes that Father and Mother hadn't been so dreadfully particular about such things. Ah, Jo, instead of wishing that, thank God that Father and Mother were particular, and pity from your heart those who have no such guardians to hedge them round with principles, which may seem like prison walls to impatient youth, but which will prove sure foundations to build character upon in womanhood. Jo wrote no more sensational stories, deciding that the money did not pay for her share of the sensation, but going to the other extreme, as is the way with people of her stamp, she took a course of Mrs. Sherwood, Miss Edgeworth, and Hannah More, and they produced a tale which might have been more properly called an essay or a sermon, so intensely moral was it. She had her doubts about it from the beginning, for her lively fancy and girlish romance felt as ill at ease in the new style as she would have done masquerading in the stiff and cumbrous costume of the last century. She sent this didactic gem to several markets, but it found no purchaser, and she was inclined to agree with Mr. Dashwood that morals didn't sell. Then she tried a child's story, which she could easily have disposed of if she had not been mercenary enough to demand filthy lucre for it. The only person who offered enough to make it worth her while to try juvenile literature was a worthy gentleman who felt it his mission to convert all the world to his particular belief. But much as she liked to write for children, Jo could not consent to depict all her naughty boys as being eaten by bears or tossed by mad bulls because they did not go to a particular Sabbath school, nor all the good infants who did go, of course, as rewarded by every kind of bliss, from gilded gingerbread to escorts of angels when they departed this life, with psalms or sermons on their lisping tongues. So nothing came of these trials, and Jo corked up her inkstand and said in a fit of very wholesome humility, I don't know anything. I'll wait till I do before I try again, and meantime sweep mud in the street. If I can't do better, that's honest anyway, which decision proved that her second tumble down the beaten stalk had done her some good. While these internal revolutions were going on, her external life had been as busy and uneventful as usual, and if she sometimes looked serious or a little sad, excuse me, No one observed it but Professor Bayer. He did it so quietly that Joe never knew he was watching to see if she would accept and profit by his reproof, but she stood the test, and he was satisfied, for though no words passed between them, he knew that she had given up writing. Not only did he guess it by the fact that the second finger on her right hand was no longer inky, but she spent her evenings downstairs now, was met no more among newspaper offices, and studied with a dogged patience, which assured him that she was not bent on occupying her mind with something useful, if not pleasant. He helped her in many ways, proving himself a true friend, and Joe was happy, for while her pen lay idle, she was learning other lessons besides German, and laying a foundation for the sensation story of her own life. It was a pleasant winter, and a long one, for she did not leave Mrs. Kirk till June. Every one seemed sorry when the time came. The children were inconsolable, and Mr. Bear's hair stuck straight up all over his head, for he always rumpled it wildly when disturbed in mind. "Going home? Ah, you are happy that you have a home to go in," he said when she told him, and sat silently pulling his beard in the corner while she held a little levee on that last evening. She was going early, so she bade them all good-bye overnight, and when his turn came, she said warmly, "Now, sir, you won't forget to come and see us if you ever travel our way, will you? I'll never forgive you if you do, for I want them all to know my friend." "Do you? Shall I come?" he asked, looking down at her with an eager expression which she did not see. "Yes, come next month. Laurie graduates then, and you'd enjoy commencement as something new." "That is your best friend of whom you speak," he said in an altered tone. "Yes, my boy Teddy. I'm very proud of him, and should like you to see him." Joe looked up then, quite unconscious of anything but her own pleasure in the prospect of showing them to one another. Something in Mr. Bear's face suddenly recalled the fact that she might find Laurie more than a best friend, and simply because she particularly wished not to look as if anything was the matter, she involuntarily began to blush, and the more she tried not to, the redder she grew. If it had not been for Tina on her knee, she didn't know what would have become of her. Fortunately, the child was moved to hug her, so she managed to hide her face an instant, hoping the professor did not see it. But he did, and his own changed again from that momentary anxiety to its usual expression, as he said cordially, "I fear I shall not make the time for that, but I wish the friend much success and you all happiness. God bless you." And with that he shook hands warmly, shouldered Tina, and went away. But after the boys were abed, he sat long before his fire, with the tired look on his face, and the heimweh, or homesickness, lying heavy at his heart. Once, when he remembered Joe, as she sat with the little child in her lap, and that new softness in her face, he leaned his head on his hands a minute, and then roamed about the room as if in search of something that he could not find. "It is not for me. I must not hope in it, or hope it now," he said to himself with a sigh that was almost a groan then, as if reproaching himself for the longing that he could not repress. He went and kissed the two tousled heads upon the pillow, took down his seldom used meerschaum, and opened his Plato. He did his best, and did it manfully, but I don't think he found that a pair of rampant boys, a pipe, or even the divine Plato were very satisfactory substitutes for wife and child and home. Early as it was, he was at the station next morning to see Joe off, and, thanks to him, she began her solitary journey with a pleasant memory of a familiar face smiling its farewell, a bunch of violets to keep her company, and, best of all, the happy thought, "Well, the winter's gone, and I've written no books, earned no fortune, but I've made a friend worth having, and I'll try to keep him all my life." And that is the end of chapter 11. The next chapter, chapter 12, is called Heartache and the first word is whatever. And so we will begin there next time. Here's my bookmark. That was a little bit longer, I think, than most episodes, but it was just 2 chapters. So I think it might be the longest 2 chapters in a row that we have. And hopefully next time will be a regular length. So God bless you. Have a great night, and we will see you again next time.